Welcome back. This is the final lecture in the first unit. This is our last lecture on Northern Renaissance, focusing on the Renaissance in Germany and in England. The artists to look out for time around include Grunewald, Albrecht Dürer in Germany, and in England, the work of Hans Holbein. So one thing to be aware of at this stage of the game is that a lot of Western Europe is now technically part of what is known as the Holy Roman Empire, or the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation. You can see the contemporary borders of European countries in that purple, which indicates the spread of the Holy Roman Empire. This all dates back into the Middle Ages. Charlemagne becomes emperor in the year 800, the Carolingian era, followed by the Ottonian era, which begins in 962. So this entire region essentially becomes the inheritor of what was the Roman Empire to the fall of Rome, and ultimately the territory will eventually become under the influence of Napoleon. So we'll see Napoleon's rise really in Unit 2 into 3. So some things to be aware of in the Roman Empire here in the Renaissance is that the artwork is going to share a lot of similarities with what we've seen in Burgundy, what we've seen in Netherlands. We're going to see a lot of detail. We're going to see a lot of the composition crammed with figures and with. And we're going to see the figures pushed very close to the front of the picture plane, and definitely an overabundance of decoration, especially in the carved work. The first artist I want to look at for the purposes of a lecture summary is Martin Schenkhauer. Schenkhauer is really important for us in that he is one of the first true masters of the engraving technique. He really pioneered some of the most important printmaking techniques and created an enormous body of work. He thought of his prints truly as fine art in their own right, rather than merely as reproductions of pre-existing works or as illustrations. At this point, at least 115 engravings by him exist and have been authenticated. And this is definitely the most famous of all works, The Temptation of St. Anthony. And you can see here a lot of the Northern Renaissance style that we looked at with artists like Hieronymus Bosch. We certainly have seen, even in Holbein's work, some of this attention to kind of the macabre aspect of religious expression. These are other Schenkhauer, other engravings that really do emphasize all of the northern qualities that we've seen, but also depict some of the stories of the Bible with a bit more gruesome detail than we may have been accustomed to seeing earlier. Definitely the work of Matthias Grunewald is important for us to work is definitely seminal to the German Renaissance style. This is the front and back of an altarpiece that would have been placed along the crossing in a cathedral, and so the area that's highlighted in yellow is the nave. That's the central aisle where the pew would be. The crucifixion is the scene that would have been visible from that side. That's this image here, which definitely shows much more to the torture of Christ in the crucifixion scene. The image of carrying the cross would have been visible from the choir area. That's this dark greenish area here. Grunewald is also known for this rather remarkable painting, The Meeting of St. Ernst and St. Maurice. The character of Maurice is kind of an interesting one for us. He was a member of the Roman Empire, Roman army, Roman Empire. However, he was born in Egypt. He was martyred when his legion refused to persecute a group of Christians, and in fact, the group of soldiers was tasked with that task twice, and he refused both times. So he's definitely an important figure, but as he is of Egyptian descent, many artists have depicted him as having darker skin, and it's interesting to see that he is the main character of this story depicted by Grunewald, but he's also prominent in all of these works in which he appears always as light Caucasian. Grunewald's most important piece here is the Isenheim Altarpiece. I wanted you to get a sense of how large actually is. This gives you a photograph of people seeing the altarpiece in its position in the church. So the figures themselves are essentially life-size, larger than life-sized. It was originally commissioned by an Italian knight who was the leader of a monastery in Isenheim, so this does have a connection to us, to Italy in a sense as well. The altarpiece itself could be displayed in three different ways. So the altarpiece could be seen in this particular arrangement, showing the figures in the paint on the flanking sides, including St. Anthony, who we saw in Schenkhauer's print. We can also see the Temptation there of St. Anthony. You can see St. Paul on the left-hand side. That shrine then can be closed to show the scene of the Nativity and the scene of the Annunciation. But on of the week, this is how the altarpiece would appear. So remember that the altarpiece, the Isenheim altarpiece, is for a chapel that serves for people who would be caring for people dying from the plague. So it's not direct in the hospital, but it serves the region of the hospital. So the people who are coming to see the altarpiece, people who are coming to the church to pray on a daily basis, are going to be primarily people who are either healthcare providers, or more likely, more frequently, a larger number would be people who are facing death from this horrific illness. So if you think about it, in a sense, that may explain why Grunewald's depiction is so gruesome. If you think of Christ as acting as the figure who takes on sins, who takes on form in order to learn about the pain of what it's like to be human, then you can kind of imagine that people who are facing extreme health concerns, some comfort in knowing that God has suffered the way that they're suffering, or perhaps even in a more horrific way. It's able then for you to imagine yourself being interceded on your behalf, to have Christ intercede for you between you and a higher power. Kind of makes sense. You can see that the figure is really emaciated. You can see the wounds from being scourged with the whip. You can see the spear wound in the side. Obviously, crucifixion wounds themselves in the palms and the feet. But you can clearly see that his arms have been dislocated from the shoulder joint, and you can see the broken ankle. The weight of the body presses down against the immovable pinion of the feet through the stone, or through the spike as well. When you see it up close, it is really rather shocking and almost impossible to look at, but you have to remember that part of the reason that the image works as well as it does is it really emphasizes the human aspect of Christ, and really reminds us, I think, to consider him as being a sacrifice on our behalf. The idea of God becoming flesh and then taking on of what human beings do to other human beings would certainly make him compassionate, I think, toward people who were suffering in any physical way, especially. And so that's part of the reason why we want to think about this altarpiece as being something that would be both gruesome and kind of terrifying, but at the same time, in a weird way, kind of comforting to people who were in a really extreme situation themselves. It's a remarkable accomplishment. It's really rather difficult to, because of its bloodiness and because of the intensity of the detail, but there's no question that if this is God, God is willing to make this much, take this much pain on our behalf, then surely he could stand in for us as we're facing anything own lives. The next big star for us to know is Albrecht Dürer, and Durer is also very much a printmaker, and very well, of course, as a painter as well. That's his own self-portrait at the age of 13, and you can see that, like some of the other artists that we've looked at, pretty precocious talent early on in his life. It's kind of remarkable to compare him to other artists. When you compare him to Raphael's self-portrait, it's really fascinating to see how similar those two drawings really are. Durer is sometimes called the Leonardo of the North because of the level of his anatomical precision, as well as his interest in the art of nature. We definitely see with Durer someone who does travel the world, and he does in fact go to Italy at least twice, once from 1494 to 95, and a second trip a little bit longer, 1505. 1507. He also was in service to Emperor Maximilian, and we'll see the impact of his work there. This is the printmaker that Durr, pretty intriguing woodcut print. If you know printmaking techniques, you know that with woodcut, anything that's white in the image has to be away from a flat piece of wood. The areas that are left are raised up, of course, from the background where you've carved it away, and that area would be inked and then printed to paper. There's an Albrecht Dürer self-portrait there at the age of 22. This piece was most likely made to accompany his pending wedding, which his parents had arranged for him while he was away from home. So probably not the happiest of marriages. The sketch to the side is the sketch of the girl that he is engaged to and ends up actually marrying. He is an incredibly skilled draftsman and observer of nature and of landscape. These are some of his travel watercolors. They're just beautiful, and definitely give us a sense of his ability to record the world around him, and his love of travel and his love of Italy in particular. Well known for oil paintings on panel. These pieces definitely have some of the northern qualities that we've come to expect. The figures close to the picture plane, close to the front of the plane, lots of detail in a small amount of space, all achieved really through that glazing technique of oil. By the time he's 26, he's become a really successful and well-known artist. He clearly is a little bit aware of his own power painting. He does have a little hint of arrogance, I think, in this particular image. This portrait comes from 1498. It is inscribed, "I have thus myself was 26 years old," and then his name. Durr also is really well known for these series of woodcuts, many of which are scenes. This is a series, though, that focuses a bit on the mythological stories as well. This is Hercules. Martyrdom of St. Catherine. You can see the Catherine wheel there on fire. And then perhaps the one he's most famous for in terms of woodcuts, the series that includes the Revelation of the Apocalypse. This is Revelation of St. John, number 4, the 4 riders of the Apocalypse. So you can see he's really become an absolute master of carving wood printing technique. Woman clothed with the sun and the seven-headed dragon is a theme that'll come back again, and several artists will see the same story inspiring the work of William Blake much later. The Dragon, we've seen this story before in different forms. Here in terms of their size, this is the scenes from the Passion. This is his version of the Last Supper. Christ in limbo, he's being tormented. And then these are engravings from the 1490s into the early 1500s in the wilderness. For witches, there's so many to look at, and I've included a bunch more than these for you to see. This lecture has a ton of extra slides toward the end. If you're interested in printmaking at all, if you're interested in Durer's storytelling, you can certainly take a look into those more in The engravings he's best known for include these this series from 1504. This is Adam and Eve. With an engraving, the image is made on a copper plate. The lines are incised using a tool known as a burin, and it carves a very thin, narrow, small line into the surface of the copper plate. And it's the reverse of woodcut. In this case, where we cut the plate is where the ink is going to stick. The ink is applied to the whole, and that wiping forces the ink down into the grooves and wipes it off of the areas that are meant to be white, and then the print can be printed using a printing with a cylindrical roller. So it does allow you to get a little bit more highlight and shadow. If you're familiar with hatching and cross hatching, you can see this is actually a series of closely packed lines. More lines closer together is going to make an area appear darker. Fewer lines spaced further apart will make an area appear lighter. Durr was known for his portraits of other people, but this is the piece I want you to know of portraiture, self-portrait at the age of 28, which is from the year 1500. It is definitely a masterpiece of his ability to show the detail of the hair, the anatomy in his hands and his face. The proportions are just about as perfect as they could be. The painting really and you can see almost every individual hair of the fur on the collar of his garment. You can see the detachable sleeves. You can see the sleeves underneath. He's clearly showing you that he's not only a master of his art, he's aware of his own attractiveness physically. He's also aware of rules of fashion. He's certainly kind of especially this piece known as the young hare. He's certainly got other subjects that may be of interest to you as well in his studies of nature. I personally really like these two paintings. The one on the left is known as the large, so named because there is a smaller piece called the small turf. But one of the things I like about these is that he does kind of show you that a small area of observation can reveal truths about the larger aspects of our relationship to the universe. If you're aware of fractal theory, a fractal is the smallest building block of the image is the pattern for the entirety of the pattern. And if you look at his paintings of the turf, you can kind of imagine that even though he's showing you a very small section of the earth, there's a small amount of soil and a small amount of plant life, a small amount of air behind that space. It is almost the whole of the earth. There's water, land, plant, sky. By focusing on something small, you can kind of reveal truths about the environment as a whole. It's kind of a remarkable accomplishment. Definitely he's got skill in creating religious themed works, and we certainly see that here in the Adoration of the Magi piece. There's no question that Durer is a master of perspective by this point as well. Notice we're around 1504 now with this piece, so this is the exact moment that Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raphael are all living in world. So this is really the height of the High Renaissance, both in Italy and here in Germany as well. Throughout the Western world, throughout Western Europe, we've got this moment in which artists are addressing their concerns in reality, while also showing narrative stories about religious subjects. They are trying to really perfect the illusion of making a three-dimensional space appear believable on a two-dimensional surface. And certainly Durr is one of the masters of that type of work. These engravings that are probably his second most important works to know include this piece, Night, Death, and the Devil. Engravings, there are 3 images in this set. One edition was given as a gift by the artist to and philosopher Martin Luther. So we're starting to see a connection between the leading artists of the era and the leading religious scholars and philosophers. Now, this piece is definitely loaded with symbolism, and we've seen that, I think, more outside of Italy than we even did in Italy proper. The piece is almost a parable of your life as a Christian. What you're seeing here is this soldier figure, knight, on horseback. He kind of represents a human being, and he is going forward bravely, supported by the dog, the symbol of fidelity, and he is sort of haunted in some ways, or even hunted by this figure in the background. The devil is right there waiting to take him down, and riding beside him on this kind of emaciated horse is a figure that clearly is representing death. He's holding an hourglass, just in case you didn't get there. He's sort of taunting the knight, knowing that his time on earth is short. There's a memento mori of the skull right there beside Durr. So you can clearly see that the knight is aware of the existence of evil and the existence of death, and the knowledge that his life on earth is going to be brief, but he still bravely goes forward doing the right thing. The other images that go in this particular set include St. Jerome, and this really intriguing image known as Melancholia, the figure of melancholy. Melancholy kind of represents the idea of being sad, but not necessarily with an obvious traceable cause, that kind of feeling of despair when there isn't a particular problem that has caused it, but you feel world weary and you feel unable to cope. But if you really look at what surrounds this angelic figure of melancholy, are all of the possible tools, scientific tools, mathematical tools, physical tools, and an escape route in symbol of the latter, which I think is a lesson for all of us, that even in a moment when you feel despair and you feel that there's no hope, there probably are that you're not allowing yourself to see, that if we would allow ourselves to look into the support that's around us, we might actually a way out of some of our despair. While he's working for the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I, Durer is tasked with this incredible homage to the emperor. He wants essentially a triumphal arch like the emperors of old, and if you took art history 1, you saw plenty of triumphal arches in the Roman Empire. This is a printed version. The entire piece is 3 meters in height, roughly 9 feet in height, composed of 192 separate woodcut, carved and printed blocks. It's an absolutely astonishing accomplishment just in terms of scale. It may not be his absolute most beautiful work in some respects, but it's certainly the most intriguing and one of the most challenging pieces. Portrait of the Emperor. Nature studies from the 1510s into the 15 teens. This is one of my favorite of his drawings studies. It's a portrait of his own mother. And it does kind of everything that you would hope for a Northern Renaissance piece to be. It shows her as she objectively, realistically looks in the real world, glamorizing her. So it is not trying to do away with what we might consider to be flaws, imperfections, or to decrease the effects of her age. If anything, it really kind of celebrates the fact that she has survived. If you think about it, every wrinkle is kind of something that could be seen as a badge of honor, something that records the fact that you have as long as you have in order to earn that status. I think there is a weirdly loving aspect of the way that he has portrayed her in this particular piece. It really is kind of a tour de force of his realism, his skill as a draftsman, as someone who's able to draw, but all of his commitment to reality and his ability to express in an emotional way his point of view through an image of another person. You guys would kind of groove on this piece. It's sort of an interesting one. Durr produced a drawing and then a woodcut based solely on a friend's who had seen a rhinoceros. So this is kind of a remarkable first in his career. This first rhinoceros in Europe was given as a gift from a sultan. It's kind of fascinating to think about not having seen this creature and being intrigued by it and hearing about it, and then Durr creating this rather fanciful but incredible image to record for us what the animal actually looks like. He's certainly got the horn, and the proportions are pretty good, but it looks a little more armored than reality allow. Same with the walrus. The walrus, I think it's entirely possible that he did actually see a carcass of one, and it's kind of extrapolating from there, but clearly if you've seen one in reality, this piece doesn't get exactly all of the details correct. On more safe ground, certainly in paintings and drawings of human beings, his accuracy and detail really cannot be matched. This is an example of how much attention the artists of the Renaissance are giving to accuracy in proportion and spatial illusion. What you're seeing is a woodcut by Durer of an artist drawing a foreshortened view of a reclining female figure. So from his point of view, of course, her knees are closer to him and her head would be the furthest thing away. You notice in front of him something that looks almost like a dagger or a small obelisk. That's so that he point to keep his head stationary so that his eyes are in the same position the entire time. He's looking at her through a screen of wire, and those wires they break the plane that he's looking through into squares that are equivalent to the squares on the drawing paper in front of him. So by matching what he sees in each individual square, he's going to end up with a drawing that would show her foreshortened body in perfect perspective. And it's tools that artists used to help them understand how perspective worked in the Renaissance. We know that Durr is connected both to Martin Luther and to Erasmus of Rotterdam, and so we know that there is a really strong connection between the work that Durr is doing and reception and the effect on him of his association with religious scholars, leading us into the truly of Protestant faiths as we begin to move away from Catholicism. The last artist we want to look at is Hans Holbein the Younger. I thought you would kind of enjoy him as well. He actually ends up moving to England and working for the of King Henry VIII, and there you see Henry on the right. Henry actually used Holbein somewhat as, well, almost like a date. If you think about it, he was always on the search for the perfect bride, and specifically to have a bride of the right political station, the right allegiances could be made through marriage, but he also needed for his bride to produce an heir, and it didn't happen. He was Catholic and was unable to divorce his wife, so the only way to get out of the marriage was to have the wife. So you know Henry VIII had many, many wives. Eventually this whole system begins to break down, and one of the reasons that he's able to found the first real Protestant breakaway church from the Catholic Church was really so that he would be allowed to practice divorce, so that he could have his relationships the way he wanted to have them, uncontrolled by the Pope. The way that he used Holbein was kind of interesting. He would have Holbein portraits of potential brides that he would then use to decide whether or not he was interested in pursuing a relationship. And at least one occasion, Holbein created a portrait of Anne of Cleves that that Henry VIII liked, and then when he met Anne of Cleves, felt that she was not as beautiful as the portrait, and he in fact referred to her as a mare, a female horse, and was very angry with Holbein for not being as should be. Kind of funny image. These are Holbein's portraits of Sir Thomas More and Erasmus of Rotterdam. So you certainly see the beginnings of church reform, the beginnings of some new philosophical ideas being celebrated by these artists of the Northern Renaissance. certainly one of Clement's most successful portraits in terms of technique is this portrait of Guise the Merchant. If you look at it up close, astonished at how accurate he is in terms of replicating textures. The silken fabric looks really different to the other fabrics that are nearby. You can even sense that Guise's hair could use some conditioner. It almost looks brittle. It's so dry. The fabric from the paper, which looks different from the metal and the glass. It's a master class in replicating what the world really looks like through careful use of paint, especially when you see some of these items up close. It's kind of astonishing to think that this isn't a photograph, that this was painted by a human being. It's just astonishing in level of skill and level of detail, down to the words in the text on the wall, the paper on the wall. This includes a Latin poem with a Greek title translated into English. It's kind of awesome. What you see is picture showing his features, how vivid his eyes are, and how his cheek is formed in his 34th year of age. If we back it up so you can see where that poem is really small relative to the size of the entire painting, it's just an incredible accomplishment from a technical point of view. The piece wants to know for sure is known as the French ambassadors, and these are ambassadors from the court of Francis I, King of France, to Henry VIII. And they are essentially helping to officiate or to facilitate the marriage to Anne Boleyn. So you can see that figures on the left, you have Jean d'Anville, who's 29 years old. On the right is the 25-year-old Georges de Selve, who's the Bishop of the crucifix in the upper left corner kind of gives a little hint to the religious nature of their job. It's both political and religious. Crucifix right there. There are plenty of objects on the table that speak to these gentlemen's worldliness, to being world travelers, being ambassadors, to being highly cultured. You see instruments of music, suggestions of literature as well. Clearly of the world, and they're also, of course, sporting the latest fashions. You can see some slashing here in the sleeves and even in the breast of this coat. You can see also that making the shoulders of male figures appear much, much larger than reality, almost like football player padding, is something that's very popular in most of the European courts, but in particular with the French and English courts. There's also in this image hidden memento mori that at first glance may not be obvious. You may sort of sense that there's an odd piece of fabric or something on the floor, but on you start to realize that there is an altered image in that space. It is a memento mori, a reminder of death, and it is also what we call an anamorphic projection. It is a projection that you may be familiar with, this kind of style of optical illusion. Chalk art, you may have seen people creating images in chalk on the ground that, when seen from the right angle, appear to create spatial possible illusions of space. And that's sort of what's happening here. This painting would originally have been hung in a staircase, and you would have seen it from the side. If you go to the side and look across the surface instead of straight ahead onto it, that strangely distorted shape, you see it from this angle, is now revealed in this form. It changes its perspective, and suddenly it looks like a fully, perfectly proportionate floating three-dimensional realized illusion of a floating skull. It's a really remarkable accomplishment and a strangely hidden image in that portrait of the ambassadors. So you can see here on the side what the effect would be like. If you were looking at it from the side, imagine you're going down a staircase, and right about this point to kind of the section just below the middle, and suddenly that skull pops out at you as if it's floating in space. Almost a ghostly, eerie effect. We definitely know more about anamorphosis than we had earlier at the point of the Renaissance. It really becomes a little bit more common to use this kind of illusion. Again, we see it a lot in today's chalk art. One of the earliest examples that show you, though, is actually from, believe it or not, a Leonardo da Vinci notebook, and that's what you're seeing right here in the Codex Atlanticus. We have these odd elongated sketches. If you see from the right angle, actually makes them go back into proper perspective. So it makes sense Leonardo would be interested in this effect as well. There's plenty more examples of interesting works by Albright Durer to finish out the rest of this lecture if you have the time to take a look at those. There's something like 225 images altogether. So for those who are interested in printmaking and in Albright Durer in particular, have fun with